In 1946, the British motor industry was struggling to readjust to peacetime trading. The demand for new cars was there, but shortages of raw materials meant an artificial market, where pre-war bangers were more money than new models. It was even harder for the specialist manufacturer, relying as they did on bought-in components. Late in that year, a northern engineering industrialist, David Brown, spotted a small ad in the Times offering a sale of a sports car company.
Well, the way it came about was that I saw an advertisement in the Times newspaper, a sports car company for sale, and after some negotiation I bought it.
Purely on a whim, he bought the company for £20,000. It was Aston Martin. A few months later, he also bought the Ayling-Lagonda company. The combination of Claude Hill's new Aston Martin and Lagonda's W.O. Bentley designed twin-cam engine was to be the basis of the DB line of Aston Martins. A line which for the next 16 years was to grace the grids of all the classic sports car races, the high point of which being the win at Le Mans, the most important of them all. In 1950, Sir David Brown employed John Wire, ex-Sunbeam Motor Company, ex-Solex, ex-Monaco Motors, a man with experience in motorsport. Originally a temporary appointment as team manager, John Wire went on to become managing director of Aston Martin by the end of his stay with the company. Wire's first race with his new team was to be the 1950 Le Mans Oval race, where the cars were DB2s and almost standard production models. Wire had inherited Lance Macklin and Charles Brackenbury as contracted drivers, and to these he added Jack Fairman. Macklin suggested George Abecassis, and in turn he introduced Reg Parnell, Britain's most famous racing driver of the time. The sixth driver was Eric Thompson. Jack Fairman was involved in a road accident on the way to Le Mans. His wife detained in hospital, very pregnant. It was decided to substitute John Gordon, a friend of Le Patron, David Brown. Considering the lack of performance, the cars were only capable of 125 miles an hour. The results were encouraging. Macklin and Abecassis won the 3-litre class and were 5th overall. The Brackenbury Parnell car, one place behind, was 6th, and the third car retired with a broken crank after 8 laps. The next outing was at Silverstone in August, but it was a disappointing day, and the best result came from Raymond Sommer, deputising for the injured Macklin, who came home 10th, just beaten in the class by Duncan Hamilton in a Silverstone Healy. The race was won by Peter Walker's XK120. As 1950 drew to a close, Aston Martin began to take stock of the situation. With the departure of Claude Hill, Professor Eberron von Evenhurst was taken on as chief engineer and designer. Ex-Auto Union, his brief was to work on the DB3, a ground-up racing design. But work was slow, and for the 1951 season, as a stopgap measure, 2 lightweight DB2s were built. As a shakedown for Le Mans, Parnell and Abecassis drove the new lightweights at Silverstone in May, and Parnell finished 6th, while Abecassis retired with the familiar problem for Aston's gearbox trouble. For Le Mans, there were still only 2 lightweights, so VMF 64, Brown's personal car, which had finished 5th in 1950, was pressed into service. Amazingly, the old retainer, in the hands of Macklin and Thompson, beat the 2 new cars to finish 3rd behind the new C-Type Jaguar, the winner, Peters, Walker and Whitehead at the wheel. Second place was the Mary Mares Talbot, and Abecassis was 5th, with Parnell in 7th place, one of Aston's finest results with a team of 3 cars and 2 private entries, all finishing the 24-hour marathon. Sadly, not a single works car would finish Le Mans for 3 long years. For 1952, it was decided to attempt the Italian long-distance classic de Mille. Journalist Tommy Wisdom had entered the race before in a DB2, in fact VMF 64, and won the GT class. He was co-opted into the team, and with 2 other DB2s prepared for Reg Parnell and Macklin, off they went. While the experienced Wisdom and Parnell arrived back in Brescia 1st and 2nd in the GT class, and 12th and 13th overall in a race dominated by both the Ferraris and the Maseratis. The DB3s opened their 1952 season at Silverstone in May, Parnell finishing 2nd behind Moss's Jaguar C-Type with Abecassis 3rd. By the time Le Mans came round in June, young Peter Collins, the brightest star on the British scene, had joined the team. 3 DB3s were entered, and for Parnell and Thompson, Poor and Pat Griffiths, and Lance Macklin and New Boy Collins, it was not a happy race, for within an hour Parnell was out with final drive trouble. An hour later, the Astons were down to 1 car when Poor and Griffith expired with water pump failure, and then Collins and Macklin didn't do much better. They lasted for 20 hours. They were up to third behind the two 300 SL Mercedes-Benz, before, unfortunately, their car struck problems and succumbed to the rear axle malady. This was the race that was also a disaster for Jaguar. For the Goodwood 9-hour race in August, the team had a car for Parnell with a 2.9-litre engine. It was overboard with offset cylinders, and this caused endless problems. These problems delayed the use of the larger engine, which had been tried just once before at Monaco earlier in the season. The other two cars were the normal 2.6 for Abecassis and Poor, and Collins and Pat Griffith. Once again, the 2.9-litre car caused trouble. There was a fire, John Wire was burned, and the pit was taken over by Parnell. Collins and Griffiths came through to win. Something different was needed, and this was the DB3S, which was produced during the winter of 1952, when it was realized that they needed a more competitive car. The DB3 was too big and heavy to keep up with the ever-rising speeds. Willie Watson, who'd been designer for Bentley before the war, came up with the concept of the DB3S. Height was reduced by cranking the chassis, and the use of thinner gauge metal allowed a handsome weight reduction. David Browns in Huddersfield came up with a new lightweight spiral bevel drive, and the whole car was clothed in a beautiful Frank Feely designed body. The new car was not ready for the Minimelia in April, when 4 of the older DB3s were taken there, and Tommy Wisdom, in again the DB2, won the production class as he had in 51 and 52. Abecassis retired, Collins finished 16th after an accident, but Parnell finished a brilliant 5th, a position that could well have been higher had they not had to drive most of the second half of the race with a broken Panhard rod. By June and Le Mans, the new cars were ready. Roy Salvadori, now living in retirement above the start at Monte Carlo, was drafted into the team. He was to be Aston's most successful driver.
I think that was the start of Aston Martin's interest in me as a driver, and shortly after that John Wire approached me and offered me a position in the team, which I grabbed at, of course.
We asked Roy where he actually saw Aston Martin rating in the manufacturers' teams of the day.
Well, they were always potential winners on the British circuits, the slower circuits, but of course they weren't winners as far as Le Mans was concerned. You just had to look to the class win. At that particular stage, they had the DB3s, but they did have the DB3S, which happened the next year, 53, which was a more competitive car for tight circuits, not for Le Mans type circuits. They were terribly serious, very well organized, very much better, for instance, than Jaguars. They really had a very serious setup. They just didn't have the machine in those years. Don't forget that also they had a 3-litre engine. We were competing in those days against the 3.5, 3.7 Jaguars. So we were down on capacity, and the 4.5-litre Ferraris and Maseratis. So we were trying it on with the 3-litre car in that sense. John Wire, he was, I think, he was the best team manager ever. He got the best out of the machinery that he had. His organization was absolutely first rate. Our pit stops were always better than the opposition. The pit work was first rate. And he just really had, the limitation there was the 3-litre capacity.
The 1953 Le Mans was a disaster for Aston Martin. Parnell and Abecassis raced each other. Parnell crashed, and Abecassis handed over to Salvadori with clutch slip, resulting in that machine retiring shortly afterwards. Just Poor and Thompson lasted longest, and they were withdrawn after 15 hours with engine failure. After this disastrous debut, the car did improve throughout the year, and the results started to come. Parnell took the prototype and won the Empire Trophy in the Isle of Man, Aston's first classic win, and then in September, Collins won the Tourist Trophy at Dundrod with a brilliant drive, and Parnell came second. This was by far and away their best international result, and the team started 54 with high hopes, and it was to provide them with their worst season ever. Out of 15 races, only 2 cars got to the finish. Collins managed 3rd at Buenos Aires, 13th in the Tourist Trophy, and not a single car reached the end of Sebring, or Mille, or for that matter Le Mans, where 2 were destroyed. Things had to get better in 1955,